their silence. Sounds, big sounds, small sounds, sounds. Sounds of hate, sounds of whispering, sounds. Sounds of loneliness, sounds of desire, sounds of need, sounds of freedom, sounds of thought, sounds of hope, sounds of hate, sounds of dreaming, sounds of pain, sounds of weeping, sounds of hurting, sounds of wanting, sounds of screaming, sounds of memories, sound of the future, sounds of endless moment. Sounds without meaning, sounds without purpose, sounds without hope, sounds of hows, if, buts, maybe, sounds of yesterday, sounds of times gone by, sounds of mass incarceration, sounds of black men being shot by the police, sounds. Sounds of futility, sounds of the death penalty, sounds of the far right, sounds of civil and human rights, sounds of black power, black panthers, black nationalism, black lives matter, black lives don't matter, apartheid. Sounds. Sounds of segregation, sounds of the Niagara movement, Harlem Renaissance, negritude, the black arts movement, sounds of black poetry, black theatre, black music, gospel, blues, jazz, hip-hop, reggae, soca, afrobeat, calypso, sounds of Ferguson, sounds of Charleston, sounds. Sounds of the new Jim Crow, sounds of black resistance, sounds of black struggle, sounds of black revolution, sounds of black intellectual ideas, sounds of black consciousness, sounds of black solutions, sounds of black liberation, sounds of black freedom, sounds of black peace. Sounds. Sounds of black pain. Sounds. Ever since the fate of African peoples was debated, signed, sealed and decided, their descendants have been enslaved, oppressed, scattered, vilified and derided. Many white historians have made claims using methods that are poorly analytical, whilst many black scholars have tried to make the agenda much blacker and more political. And in spite of all the research that's been funded, carried out, tested and conducted, the race and crime debate falls on deaf ears and is badly negated and badly corrupted. Whilst the privileged elite ignore their implicit bias, necessary changes are overtly resisted, as the machinery of control and risk by the corporate world is privatized and duly enlisted. Discussing racial disparity and criminal justice in academia is hardly ever shared. This omission can no longer be tolerated, must be challenged and must be aired. We need a new lens to view the issues that must be made visible and brought to the fore, and focus less on the symptoms of inequalities and focus more on the core. Desistance explains how offenders come off the road and terminate their offending, whilst mass incarceration for black people as a whole is growing and never ever ending. As intersectionality talks about the different social locations connected to systems of power, the criminal justice system's racialized motto screams to control, oppress and devour. How do we erode institutional power that maintains and sustains racist policies and practice? And how do we address the systemic context that oppresses by turning bias on its axis? How can black offenders cease offending if their dreams are not embraced and supported? And how can they tell their own stories if their voices are always silenced and always thwarted? How do they begin to see a future when colourblind research is academic norm? When statistics obscure the lived reality of race using methods that are tied and worn? How then can black offenders experience meaningful and productive reintegration if ideas that are supposed to assist them increases, not reduces their subordination? Desistance for black offenders requires pushing forward racial justice goals and needs, provide insights and context and expose how the criminal justice system consumes and feeds. It should then generate a counter-narrative telling stories of black resistance that will create a pathway and a transition towards their re-entry and their desistance. Black scholars must contest and remove systems of inequality and racialized subordination. To do so, what Garvey said, some unified collective politicized coordination. This counter-narrative must move beyond mere descriptive accounts of black oppression, where the emerging truths become a tipping point for action, transition and yes, progression. How can black offenders be effectively worked with and properly be rehabilitated? How can we stop the moral panic when the right wing wants black offenders annihilated? How can intersectional processes in criminal justice systems be better understood? And how can disparities be addressed, improving things for everyone's greater good? How can rehabilitative processes engage black offenders whether they are context dependent? If their resistance is impeded by a system that offers them nothing remotely transcendent? How do they re-enter from prison when there are major obstacles to staying crime-free? When the racialization of the social structure turns the lock and then throws away the key? To successfully desist, black offenders need to return back to their home communities, where both sides are brought together to explore mutual benefits and real opportunities. Work needs to be done to help them understand about the victims they have affected, using restorative means, building social capital where they are relocated and reconnected, where efforts are made to create meaningful opportunities that will support and engage, where hopes and dreams that will enable them to have a second chance and turn a new page, where they will be able to propel themselves, creating the pathways that enable them to desist. Otherwise their bid for freedom will be taken away as the criminal justice will insist. Whilst black offenders threaten the social order that protects the interests of the elite, opposition must be constant where blame is laid firmly at the system's feet. Desistance must include a new way to improve black self-concept and increase racial pride, whilst effective theoretical ideas must be driven out and exposed with nowhere to hide. Black misincarceration must be reframed within a new political and historical frame, where notions of control, power and privilege are cast out, never to linger or to remain. Whilst intersectionality should include and transcend the binary opposition of race, to show how a true reflection of the black experience of justice can take its rightful place. So what should this paradigm shift consist of? Talk about, look like, contain and entail. And how would this position bring about change and transformation and ultimately lift the veil? This revision must envision foregrounding black offenders' desistance aspirations and examine how racism and white privilege are impacting on many black generations. The intersection of crime and racialization needs to be better understood and explained, whilst poor research should be exposed, brought to account, named and then shamed. We need to defend the infringed civil and human rights of black offenders as a whole, whilst challenging traditional theories by questioning their elitist and privileged role. We must ensure that the counter-narrative of black offenders is given real prominence. It needs to be pragmatic, assertive and told using culturally competent common sense. We must necessitate and encourage black offenders to transcend all of their silence and recognize racial privilege as a form of psychic lynching and plain old racist violence. We must further challenge the dominant discourse on racialization within criminology and demand racial reform with the criminal justice system without fear or apology. We must oppose dominant meanings in relation to social change and power relation and fight against house slaves in the master's house wanting acceptance and assimilation. We must provide a new lens to analyze how racism reduces social patterns and how the racialization of the criminal justice system creates its trends and its fashions. We must start to raise the profile of black criminological theorizing about crime as a whole. Start a different conversation, putting Uncle Tom's scholars on probation and on parole. We must embrace and include unified perspectives that enables black offenders to desist and move beyond philosophies and theories that fabricates and focus purely on the risk. Malcolm X's wisdom stated you're either part of the problem or part of the solution. Where do you stand? What's your position? What is your contribution? We can no longer be bound by other people's notions and definitions of how we see race. We can no longer allow our thoughts, dreams and our ideas to disappear without trace. We can no longer allow ideas about race, crime and justice to be shaped by presumption. We can no longer embrace an agenda owned and run by white privileged consumption. We can no longer listen and praise white and black lies, myths and unrealistic illusions. We can no longer operate with false consciousness, distractions and have no solutions. We can no longer tolerate, conceal, hide and bespeaking everyone else's truth. We can no longer ignore the conspiracy when we have the evidence and the proof. Ever since the fate of African peoples was debated, signed, sealed and decided, their descendants have been enslaved, oppressed, scattered, vilified and derided. We must push our truths out, crush the insults, destroy the deceit and the lies. Scholars must be committed to racial justice without fear, without compromise. The system of justice that has failed black offenders and black people is just criminal. Through slavery, colonialism into modern times, the changes have been minimal. The time is now to present a counter-narrative that will inspire, revolutionize and resist. If the lessons from the past aren't learned, the opportunity for change will be sorely missed. Sounds. Big sounds. Small sounds. Sounds. Sounds of hate, sounds of whispering, sounds. Sounds of loneliness, sounds of desire, sounds of need, sounds of freedom, sounds of thoughts, sounds of hope, sounds of hate, sound of dreaming, sounds of pain, sounds of weeping, sounds. Simply sounds of hurting, sounds of wanting, sounds of screaming, sounds of memories, sounds of Ferguson, sounds of Charleston, sounds of the new Jim Crow, sounds of black pain, sounds of Black Lives Matter, sounds of Black Lives Don't Matter, sounds of black resistance, sound of black struggle, sounds of black revolution, sounds of black intellectual ideas, sounds of black consciousness, sounds of black solutions, sounds of black liberation, sounds of black freedom, sounds of black peace. Simply sound.